pandemic has been how compliant we've been. Whether it's lockdowns, check-in systems, or the wearing of masks, Australians have shown themselves to be more than willing to follow the health advice in order to keep each other safe. At the same time, we've weighed up the consequences. How much privacy are we willing to give up in the name of public safety? And for how long? And after COVID ends, what measures remain? And journalist Jon Fasman is a man who's been asking this more than others. In his new book, We See It All, he looks at technology like facial recognition software and asks how we weigh up the cost to our civil liberties and privacy rights.
I think the worrying thing about facial recognition technology is that it is dangerous when it does not perform well, and it's dangerous when it performs well. And what I mean by that is right now the error rate for a lot of facial recognition systems for recognizing non-white subjects is much, much higher than it is for recognizing white subjects. And what that means is a non-white subject runs a much greater risk of being misidentified and having someone who's not a suspect being pulled into contact with law enforcement, which is often more dangerous for non-white people than for white people. So it is dangerous in that sense, but it's also dangerous if it performs accurately because it tokens the end of our right to be anonymous in public, the end of our right to sort of not be tracked everywhere we go. I was watching what was happening in China, especially in Xinjiang, in Western China, with the construction of that surveillance state there. One of the things I came to realize is that they are no more technologically advanced than America or Australia. We have that same technology. We have that whole architecture of control. So the question to me is, what are the democratic practices we need? What are the regulations we need in place to not become China? Because it's not a technological problem that I'm writing about. It's a regulation problem and it's a democracy problem. If we decide we want to have this technology, if our community decides that the risk to privacy from facial recognition is worth the ease with which it affords police the ability to identify subjects, then we should have some sort of say over how it's used, over who gets to see it, over how long data is stored, so that we don't just allow the state through complacency and inaction to really build up a complete record of our movements and give them the ability to track us anywhere we go. The most overt way COVID has sort of impacted surveillance is that you now have these alerts that you can enable on your phone that will tell you if you've been in contact with a known COVID case. Those are optional in the States. I believe that in other places, in South Korea and Japan, they're, if not mandatory, then strongly encouraged. And I think that people trust the government with that information in a way they may not trust it with other information. So, as skeptical as I am of surveillance technology, there's a public health argument for that, provided that that information is accessible and used by public health departments and only public health departments and not law enforcement. And it's stored securely and it's thrown away after 3 months, 6 months, or however long it has to be. We may not have a clear picture of what's happening with our data, but we have the democratic means and processes to find out and to claw back our data and to compel companies and governments to not do with our data what we don't want them to do, even if we have less privacy than we once did. I just think it's important every time you're confronted with a piece of technology that could store your data, that can reveal something about you, that you make an affirmative decision to use it and you not allow sort of cynicism and complacency to bring about a world that you don't want.
Well, he's saying that we need to avoid cynicism and complacency. Gray, are you worried about your privacy?
I have to be honest, I'm much more concerned about what big tech has on me than the government. And I realise that sometimes my role is to come here and be the apologist of the national security state, but I'm generally much more concerned about big tech. I mean, in Russia, the successor to the KGB is the FSB. And in Russia, Facebook is called FSB book because people give up huge amounts of their personal data and
willingly.
The security services just troll through that.
Yep.
And same with other apps, Instagram and the like, and you're giving away your facial recognition for things like that just on an app. The Clubhouse app where people come in and talk, you're giving away your voice patterns and so on. People are willingly giving up a lot of that privacy. I'm not discounting anything that the author said, but I'm just saying people give up a lot of their privacy. And
we're consenting to it. That's the question he's posing. Are we thinking about how that's been used and for how long and in which circumstances?
Well, Probably not, but there's also been an effort to sort of make big tech benign. That Google's thing about do no evil or whatever. There's this whole idea that big tech is benign. Big tech is a corporate enterprise. It's out to make money, and if it's free, you're the product.
Do you think people really think Facebook is benign?
Well, they give up information so willingly on such personal things, and they basically make themselves the product. So I either that or they're just simply not. They're too stupid to think through what they're doing.
Well, they can simultaneously be cynical and uncertain and somehow...
But you see the problem. But this is the problem. You're giving out all this personal information at a time when the author would say people are concerned about their personal privacy. Having said that, it's kind of unrealistic in 2021, the idea that you could be an island, you could literally be a member of none of this. It's very, very hard. Everyone has to carry around a mobile phone. One of the things about the pandemic that amazed me, we're all expected to download apps. There'd be a huge part of the population that either cannot afford to keep a mobile phone or cannot afford the data, or also doesn't have the technological sophistication to participate in that. So I think there's a great assumption that we're all into big tech and that we're all happily participating in it. And unfortunately, the reality is we all seem to be happily giving up information to it as well, data on ourselves. So,
or unhappily, but still doing it, which seems to be the case. Now, Lizzie, this is your area of expertise. I want to get back to the COVID question in a moment. What do you say to people who say, well, my information's already out there, I'm not so worried about what the government can do, or I've got nothing to hide?
Well, I'm definitely not a privacy cynic, and I think most people don't like how big tech hoovers up their information and then regurgitates it back to them in the form of targeted advertising, and people see the insidious consequences of that kind of monetisation of the internet and they want to change it, and that's why I think the dominance of these platforms is actually quite unpopular with users, but they don't really feel like they've got a choice. So I think part of the problem here is regulating how information changes hands in the digital economy. I mean, to take the premise of, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to worry about, I really reject that. I think a lot of people think of privacy as this idea that Gray mentioned before, that you're an island, that you're entitled to this world closed off from view. Whereas in fact, I think it's much more expansive, and that's one of my big kind of bugbears at Digital Rights Watch, to talk about the expansive possibilities of privacy. That actually, privacy is about engaging with others on terms of your own choosing, without being watched by the government or by corporations seeking to turn that interaction into some kind of profit for themselves. And unless we cultivate that kind of openness and freedom to collaborate with others, we're going to have a very nasty form of democracy where you feel like you're constantly being watched, that tempers how you engage in public life, that frames your world in terms of the companies that you engage with, for example. So I think we do need to think about it much more expansively. And even if you have nothing to hide personally, there may be someone else who does, quite legitimately. Maybe they don't want to reveal their sexuality to their family, and they've got an entitlement to not do that. And even if you didn't have to confront that particular issue, you might agree that somebody else might be able to have that right themselves. And so we need to build systems that protect that give people choices about how their information is shared that are meaningful, so that it's not just tick a box, a consent to extensive terms and conditions without the right to perhaps negotiate these things, or regulations imposed upon these companies about how this information might be used. And the last point I'd add is there is a mutual relationship between governments and companies as to how this information changes hand. A company like Palantir, for example, a data mining company that provides services to government, including for predictive policing purposes, takes its data that it uses and analyses to provide this service to government from social media sources. So I don't think we should assume that just because we've shared information with social media companies that somehow won't find its way into the hands of government. This is data and it gets traded all the time. That's why we need to have regulation and accountability as to how that information is used.
Lizzie, can you explain for us why the COVID Safe app didn't really work?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think one of the reasons, and there were a few, is that many people don't trust the government to get these projects right. They don't trust that government will build technology that is good, that is, for example, open source or makes use of our best minds in the country. But then they also don't trust government to look after their data properly. And that lack of trust, I think, does feed in quite negatively in how technology can be used for public health purposes. I have no doubt that in future technology will be part of the solution to lots of different public health problems. But if we are going to use it effectively, the primary way in which the government can contribute to that cause is by building up a relationship of trust with the public. So that means being open and accountable. That means practicing things like data minimisation, so data is only collected for a specific purpose and then deleted. That you have some form of accountability over how that data is used and transparency. that we're treated like adults rather than children and patronised too by government, told that, you know, the COVID Safe app is like sunscreen when it clearly isn't, so that we can have a meaningful conversation about how this tech works, how it's going to be held, how those who hold this power are going to be held accountable, so that people can have faith that when they participate in these programs that it will work, and that compromise that they have to make, which we might be willing to make, is done so for the right reasons. And at the moment I don't see that happening in government, and it's a huge source of disappointment to people like me and other digital rights activists who are advocating for better policy practices in this space.
And what about the QR rollout? There were kind of a few problems with that, and people ended up being quite confused. How did you assess what happened there?
Yeah, I think it was very disappointing at the start because essentially businesses were left with this opportunity or burden, however you wish to look at it, to build these programs to collect data about individuals for contact tracing purposes. And I do think there is some merit in having a centralised government approach to this. So you design a system for holding data where it's clear what that data will be used for, when it will be deleted, what it's not going to be used for, who it's not going to be shared with, and that takes the burden then off small businesses who might otherwise be collecting all these things they don't need, have no accountability to the customer as to what it's going to be used for, when it will be deleted. So I can see some real advantages in that centralisation, and that's not what occurred. In the early stages, businesses were kind of left to their own devices to make up schemes as they went along. But of course, part of the reason is that central democratic authority developing a system like this can be held accountable by the public. And that I think is the most critically important, that we don't just outsource these things to the private sector, that we make sure they're done in a democratic way, so that if the power is misused, that the democratic elected officials will be held accountable for that. And that's what I want to see, a public conversation like that, rather than what we get, which is kind of slapdash, outsourcing to private sector without accountability, which too often characterises a lot of these tech projects.
Jon, Indigenous people have a long history of being monitored and being watched over. Has that shaped your view of surveillance at all?
Yeah, I was going to speak on two parts there, Julie. There's some really meaty conversations just then around the notion of information tech literacy. There's a challenge with this whole privacy scenario that it also reflects an education lag as well, where it's quite clear that our young ones as well coming through the education systems being tooled up with that information too about your rights in this space and what that means and the impact. So I recently did a presentation in the last year for UNESCO on this very topic about the Indigenous impact in this new literacy, information technology literacy space. And one of the factors that we have dealt with over many years, hundreds of years in Australia, the notion of how to surveil our people, and it's been a regular tried true format for a lot of governments over the years. So there's been that kind of understanding or that wariness when it comes to that. Again, it's that notion of being able to apply a greater good scenario, that things are being done with us and not to us. That's a really important factor. So to be able to claim your rights and your stakes. We talk about decolonising information technology, so making sure that we're applying a process of Narakadi, is what they say in the Polawa language, good numbers, making sure that it is reflective of our ways, our strengths, and it's not something that keeps taking from us, which is unfortunately what has happened in the past, and whether it goes from the notion of us being herded in particular environments, whether they be reserves and missions. That was a previous surveilling technique that was used just over the turn of the century with the introduction of the White Australia policy, to the notion of the way us being counted in the citizen stakes and being a part of our new data sets around the ABS, and how those numbers too are used in a lot of ways against us as a polity, as Indigenous Australians as well. There's a whole range of conversations, or there's a whole range of thinking and more proactive. I like what colleagues said earlier too around the notion of there has to be another way that we're going around the procedures and policies, because there's too much of a gap that's happening in relation to our education sphere around what next generations know and what Australians right now know about what's happening, whether it be big tech or within any particular rollout space like the COVID app that was spoken about. And I've got to say too, I'm just going to make a flag there as well, like some of those big techs, like for Indigenous social enterprise, actually do help out with us in relation to how we go about stretching those conversations. So I delivered a few how to decolonise Indigenous other technology space with Google, for example, and shows also there's other ways of making sure we keep coming at, and it should be more of a norm rather than being a one-off. And there's definitely a space in, like I said, the education sphere that we have to get sharper at about being more responsive in our curricula and our pedagogy.
Mary Louise, there's a lot of excitement, investment, expectation about future developments in tech and how that might help us with health and health collectively as well as individual health. But what parameters should be placed around that? Are we having enough of those discussions? And for example, with COVID, do there need to be sunset clauses?
Absolutely. So their sunset clauses should be twice maximum incubation period. Once that's finished, your data should disappear, and you should be told it should disappear. But I'll get back to the idea of WHO are very clear on the ethics and the human rights about data and when you're developing an app. So the QR code is an excellent alternative to the COVID Safe app, because you can actually choose to go in or out of that venue. Your data is not captured. So it's very important, but you have to remember there's a hierarchy of control for a pandemic, for example, and that hierarchy starts with getting rid of the pathogen to engineering it out, such as vaccines, and right down below here is administration, and that includes contact tracing, which these apps are contact tracers. They are to assist the contact tracer. So they shouldn't be the first level of control. They should be the level of control where if something bad goes wrong, you can switch it on and try to improve. It shouldn't be the go-to.
Okay, moving on to another matter now.